Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University on Medscape Cardiology and theheart.org. In 2016, we had a very well-received and well-discussed program on some of the gender disparities in pay in the cardiovascular profession in the context of a paper of which Pam Douglas from Duke University was the senior author. And that led me into a series of discussions with colleagues around the country, both men and women, on the broader topic regarding a relatively low number of women in the cardiovascular fields. And so what I'd like to do today is to have that conversation with one of the leaders of the American College of Cardiology's efforts to think about women in cardiovascular medicine and to try to get into some of the issues of why is it that we can have 50% women medical students, 44% women in internal medicine, and less than 15% of women in cardiovascular medicine. It strikes me that this is a pretty serious issue for the future of the field if we're leaving talent behind, meaning we're not recruiting the most talented people into the field, and by definition we can't be if the pool is 44% women in internal medicine programs and we're only ending up with less than 15% women. So for me this is a pretty serious topic for the future of the field, and I am absolutely delighted today to be joined by my friend and colleague Claire Duvernoy. Claire is an interventional cardiologist and a staff physician at the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System. She is a professor of medicine in the Division of Cardiology at the University of Michigan. And maybe most importantly for the topic that we're going to discuss today, Claire is the chair of the American College of Cardiology's Women in Cardiology Council, and she chairs the leadership group as part of that. Claire, thank you very much for joining me today on Medscape Cardiology.
Thank you so much for inviting me to your show, Bob. I'm really excited to talk about this issue with you.
Well, Claire, I know that working with you now over the course of about the last year, that not only are you passionate about the topic, but you're actually proactive about the topic, that you've been working to publish documents on the topic. You've been leading a group to address some of these issues. Maybe give us your overarching view of some of the challenges that women face in entering cardiovascular medicine, and then we'll dive down into the recent paper that was the output of a professional life survey and specifically looked at some of the issues around the pregnant cardiologist. And as an offshoot of that, get into some of the issues of academic promotion, access to leadership roles, access to mentorship. We can touch upon the pay disparities, but let's try to wrap it into the broader context. So why don't I let you kick it off?
Sounds good. So as you mentioned in your introduction, although 50% of medical students are women in this day and age, only about 13% of practicing cardiologists are women, and that number has been pretty stagnant over the last 5 or so years. And there are many reasons why that might be the case, but as you said, we are leaving talent on the table, and we need to do better with recruiting more women into cardiology. There are many perceptual issues when women look at cardiology. Probably the biggest thing is they don't see people who look like them in this field, and that can be discouraging. If there are a lack of mentors that look like you and that are trying to do what you are trying to do in your field, then you're going to be less likely to choose that area, even if it may be content that's interesting to you. I think it's unavoidable and needs to be discussed that cardiology is perceived as a very work-intensive, high-stress, long hours kind of a career, and that may put off both men and women who are interested in having time for their families and who are interested in having a healthy work-life balance. But as others have pointed out already, there are plenty of fields where the hours are long, the job is hard, the hours are unpredictable, and yet there are many more women in the field than we see in cardiology. Certainly cardiology is not for everybody, and it's not for you if you want a cushy lifestyle, but I think, and many of the women that I know, think that cardiology can be a fantastic career for women, and so we need to work to show that to the women coming into and considering the field. And so that's what the ACC Women in Cardiology section is trying to do. That's what we're trying to do with the publications that we've put out. And that's also what we're trying to do when we actually work to make the field better for women, make it more equitable, perhaps help leadership in programs and training programs and in practices to achieve a little bit more parity and achieve a little bit more work-life balance, which will benefit everyone in the end.
You know, it's interesting. I'm going to go into some of the specific topics you raise and try to get your reaction to it. But the first one that I want to comment on is, I think you've said it well, the misperception that women aren't choosing cardiology because of the intensity of the work. I reflect on things like OBGYN, where the majority of residents and fellows now are women. And there's a field where people are certainly coming in, working long, long hours in a procedural specialty and coming in at all hours of the day and night, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So I absolutely agree with you. I think that this is a misperception that women are not seeking out cardiology because of the intensity of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at other very work-intensive areas like hematology, oncology, over 30% of those specialists are women. Even general surgery, 18% of general surgeons are women. So there are fields that are considered to be work-intensive with unpredictable hours that women are choosing in greater numbers than cardiology. I think that we need to get rid of this old boys club feeling that cardiology does have. This is what we're trying to do with the Women in Cardiology section.
Yeah, well said. Let's talk about one of the things you brought up, which is that the field doesn't look like me. And to me, that's something that men are going to have to work on because, at least in the short term, the overwhelming majority of cardiologists are going to be men, and particularly in the senior ranks where many of the mentors are found. Can you talk a little bit, Claire, and maybe even bring in some of your own personal perspectives here or your own personal experiences? What do you see is effective mentorship for women? Is it exactly the same as men? Are there some differences that we ought to be aware of? And I'll use myself as an example of a senior male cardiologist who mentors a lot of young people. How can we, my group, be better at mentoring women in cardiology?
Well, I'll tell you that from my personal experience, I've had not just one mentor, I've had lots of mentors, and most of them have been men, and they've been fantastic mentors. Not from the perspective of I'm a woman and therefore this is how you can do it, but the perspective of working with me on papers and publications, on offering me opportunities to advance, and by simply being there and believing in me that I can do this work in a gender-neutral way, so that I never felt like there were barriers or that someone was saying to me, I don't think you should be doing this. My greatest mentors have been men in the field and leaders in this field, and because of them, I chose to go into cardiology. Now, I've also had great women mentors. Betsy Nabel was the division chief at the University of Michigan when I entered fellowship, and when I started as a young attending, and when I told her that I was pregnant in my first year as an interventional cardiology attending, and she could not have been more supportive and more welcoming and warm to me at every stage in my career. I remember when I was a fellow, she had a gathering for the women in the cardiology section at her home. At that time, I think there were less than 10 of us, including the fellows and the attendings. And she talked about how she has a staff of people to do the work that needs to be done so that she and her husband can pursue their careers and their kids can get taken care of and everybody can get fed. And I remember thinking, wow, she employs 3 or 4 people in her home. That's something that I will never be in a position to do. And now I do the exact same thing, and it's one of the things that I tell young people coming up is, don't be afraid to pay somebody to do work that you don't need to be doing. So there was Betsy, that was an incredible example for me, but there was also Marcus Schweiger, who was my greatest mentor as a resident and fellow, who supported me for a research year in Munich after he had gone there and left the University of Michigan. So there are so many people, mostly men, who have been mentors, and I think it points to it doesn't have to be a woman as a mentor. I think that it's important that there are some women you can look to and say, hey, look, she's doing it, I can do it too. But most of the mentors are going to be men just because of the demographics, as you said, in cardiology right now. And I think that they shouldn't be afraid to take on mentees of every stripe and work with them. And it doesn't have to just be about gender. It can be about being supportive and encouraging.
As I listen to you reflecting that what you're really describing, I think you summarized at the end, which is let's treat our mentees in many ways the same. Give them opportunities, be supportive, listen to their hopes, their dreams, and also their challenges, network and introduce them. These are all the common themes of successful mentorship, and it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. We're all looking for some of the same things to help build our career. And I love your example from Betsy, who I would agree with you. She's a great role model for many of us in academic cardiology with some of the amazing things that she's accomplished, but to also not be afraid to give people some of the practical advice as she gave you. I have a wife who was a full-time professional who we had the same idea that you have to be able to employ people to help you, whether that's doing yard work, things around the house, etc., because it is a balance, particularly if you're trying to balance two career families.
Right, exactly. My husband, who's an electrophysiologist here at the University of Michigan, always jokes that I am supporting the U.S. economy, and that's not just going shopping, because I don't do much shopping, but we employ people to do work for us, and we try to spend the time that we have with our family being together. We travel a lot together. When the kids were younger, we took them with us to almost every meeting, so we ended up having our nanny or au pair with us, the kids with us. It was kind of an entourage, but that way we got to be together a little bit more, and it worked out very well that way.
I think that divisions and departments also become better places when the atmosphere is a family-oriented atmosphere, when divisional leaders, department leaders really encourage people to bring their kids, to bring their families, to travel together, to bring their network, if you will, because it makes a division, a department, a practice, a more human place.
I agree with you, and I think the University of Michigan is a great place in that regard. People sometimes talk about how you need to separate your work and your personal lives, and I have found that that's not what works for me. My personal life is going to bleed into my professional life, and it would be artificial to try and create a barrier. And, of course, my professional life will intrude upon my personal life. There are things I'm going to have to do on the weekend, writing a paper or doing some research or going in on call, of course. And it works both ways, and that's just the reality. And I think you can make yourself crazy a little bit if you try to build an absolute wall between those things. Your colleagues and even your patients like to hear about what's going on in your personal life. I have so many patients who've been my patients now for 15, 20 years who want to know, oh, so how old are your kids now? What are they doing? And just like I want to hear about their families. That's human nature, and I think it makes us better doctors.
Yeah, I agree with you. That is, in part, the essence of doctoring, is to develop those kind of relationships that, as you've rightly pointed out, I find the most pleasure in the relationships with my longstanding patients when they're bidirectional like that. Let's jump into some of the work that the ACC is doing, because I think the ACC has done a nice job by creating the section for the women in cardiology. And now with data from the Professional Life Survey and the recent publication in JACC, and then there was a publication last year as well from that Professional Life Survey, why don't you give the audience some background of what is the Professional Life Survey? How long has it been going on? What kind of things is it trying to learn?
Yeah, so as you said, back in 1996, ACC commissioned the first Professional Life Survey to look at many issues: gender disparities in cardiology, the experience of women and men cardiologists, the professional lives and what types of careers men and women cardiologists were choosing, and also the issue of discrimination. Then 10 years ago, in 2006, they asked the same questions again, and then most recently in 2015, we started the process again with essentially the same questions, so that now we have 20 years of data, and we can see that while some things have changed for cardiologists, there are many things that actually have not changed that much, and it gives us a lot of perspective and information in how we can move forward most effectively. The reason why ACC started this process and then as an offshoot and result of the process created the Women in Cardiology section was because of concerns about workforce shortages and lack of parity in the workforce. There were very practical concerns that led ACC to start this process. Those same concerns continue to exist. The ACC still is dealing with the potential for a workforce shortage, and we also have learned a lot through the years by conducting this survey. So, for example, a huge change that we've seen that everybody in cardiology knows about is that we've gone from a majority private practice setting to a majority hospital-employed / academic medicine, other employed physician model for cardiologists. That's been a huge change that's happened in the last 10 years, most likely. We also have seen that cardiologists have gotten older. Both men and women are aging, and that has implications for who's going to follow and who's going to do this job in the next 20 years. So those are the kind of changes that are affecting both men and women, that affect our workforce as a whole, and that we need to pay attention to have enough people in the pipeline.
A great description of how these sorts of longitudinal studies can be enormously valuable to shed insight into what's going on in the profession. And with that then as background, let's talk about the recent publication, The Pregnant Cardiologist. What was the stimulus to write about that specific question coming out of the survey? Then what were some of the key findings?
This was a paper that Amy Sarma, who's a cardiology fellow at Harvard University, and her mentor, Melissa Wood, who is on the Leadership Council of the Women in Cardiology section, brought up and thought about, and it came out of one of our leadership workshops a couple of years ago for women in cardiology. We've tried to have these workshops now, I think, going on 4 years. They've proved to be great venues for women cardiologists to get together to learn about strategies for success, negotiating tactics, and have lots of great conversations about the field and how to advance the position of women in the field. And this was a casual discussion that Melissa and some of us had about cardiologists' experiences of pregnancy and how that worked for them with their profession and their personal lives. And so coming out of that, Amy, Melissa, and colleagues developed a survey to ask about pregnancies for women cardiologists, to ask about maternity leaves, breastfeeding issues, and all of that was distilled into this paper, which, as you said, came out at the very end or the very beginning of this year, I think, and showed us that there are quite a few concerning issues and things that we need to try to change. There is a lot of difficulties with pregnancy, a very high use of assisted reproductive technologies. There is a lot of pressure that women described to take shorter maternity leaves, pressures that may lead to premature discontinuation of breastfeeding, issues that I don't think are unique to cardiology, but that we can really try to do something about, and that have led me personally to want to talk with program directors and administrative leadership in cardiology practices to see whether we can advocate for some policies that would help women to have more successful pregnancies, to not feel these kinds of pressures that this survey seemed to indicate that they do.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me as I read both the paper and then the commentaries around the paper is that this is an issue around pregnancy, parental leave, et cetera, that's important for the men in cardiology as well. Our men in cardiology are not taking the time they ought to take for parental leave. And I think it was you who pointed out society is better as a whole if we could arrive at some place where perhaps parental leave was not just tolerated, but really embraced and expected. Do you want to comment on that?
This struck me so strongly as I was researching both the Pregnant Cardiologist and the Professional Life Survey paper. I looked at data from especially the Scandinavian countries have been leaders in this area. There was a lot of data that showed that when men and women take parental leaves that are equal in length and that are, quite frankly, longer than what we typically see in the United States, even for women, they have more equal distribution of workload in parenting and family issues. Women in the society show higher levels of advancement and higher levels of parity in earning potential throughout the length of their careers. And society as a whole becomes a more equal society with more equal partnerships of men and women. So the implications of a relatively short period in somebody's lifespan, we're talking about less than a year in a long career, those implications have ramifications for the rest of the professional life of men and women who choose to take equal parental leaves. And that was very clear from looking at the research and the models that the Scandinavian countries provide. So obviously this is much bigger than cardiology. This is a societal issue. The United States needs to look at this and work on this. There's some tech companies in California, I think, that have instituted much more deliberate parental leave policies, and especially paternal leave, with the stipulation that, and I think this is really key, women come back to work after, say, 2 months, and then men have leave for that same period of time. And that way, there's a much more equal distribution of work, and also it's amazing how much better and closer a relationship fathers develop with their kids when you look at the data from long-term, the implications of this kind of leave. So it's something that I think we should aspire to. I don't think that we can wait for society to make changes on a legal or national level. At some point, we need to take the initiative. That's what I want to do in conjunction with the Leadership Council for the ACC Women in Cardiology section, to go to programs and say, hey, I realize it's not a law, but this is something that we would like you to consider. It will have workforce implications, and that's something that Amy goes over in the paper to some degree. You're going to have to think about who covers, who does the work if a woman is gone for 2 months and then a guy is gone for 2 months after they have a baby. Do you have to have a system where there's a covering person or a float person? That exists in other areas in medicine. I know that it's a factor in internal medicine residency, but we haven't had that in cardiology fellowship, and maybe we need to start thinking about how to do that.
Yeah, this has been a terrific example of how beginning the conversation around women in cardiology morphs into a broader discussion about what's good for the specialty, what's good for the specialty providers, all of us as cardiovascular professionals, and then ultimately, as we've talked in some other pieces of this conversation, what's good for our patients, because those sorts of healthy living arrangements also affect how we interact with our patients. Claire, I want to thank you for joining me today. We could go on another half hour, but I want to hopefully get you to come back this year so we can continue the conversation. I want to thank our listeners. Our guest today has been Dr. Claire Duvernoy, who is a staff physician at the Veterans Administration in Ann Arbor Healthcare System, and she is a professor of medicine at the University of Michigan. And for the purpose of this discussion, maybe most importantly, she's the chair of the American College of Cardiology Women in Cardiology section. Claire, thank you for joining us today on Medscape Cardiology.